Picture this scene. The summer season of 2024, Lake James, situated in North Carolina. Engineers employed by Duke Energy are undertaking a rare and exceptionally extensive maintenance operation on the deteriorating dam system, originally constructed back in the 1920s. For the very first time in more than 7 decades, they are draining the reservoir down to levels that haven't been witnessed since the Eisenhower administration years. As the water, gradually, recedes, slowly revealing muddy banks and long-forgotten landscapes that haven't experienced daylight in multiple generations, something emerges from the murky depths that causes everyone present to stop completely cold. 70 feet measured from the original shoreline, resting heavily in the thick, dense mud at what had once been the lake bottom, sits a small wooden fishing boat. However, this is not some casually abandoned vessel from the previous season. The wood is darkened with considerable age, swollen and distorted from decades spent underwater, covered thoroughly in layers upon layers of sediment that tell the complete story of 71 years beneath the water's surface. The paint, which had once been green and white in color, is now barely visible to the eye, and inside that weathered boat, tangled intricately in what remains of fishing line and trapped beneath collapsed wooden seats, are human remains. This particular boat belonged to David Miller, a beloved fisherman and devoted father of 3 children who departed from his home at dawn on June 7, 1953, telling his wife with confidence that he would be back by supper time with enough bass fish to feed the entire family for a full week. He was never seen again by anyone. His sudden disappearance devastated an entire community, launched one of the most extensive and thorough search operations in North Carolina history, and remained one of the state's most enduring and persistent mysteries for over 7 decades of time. If you find yourself drawn to stories where time itself becomes an integral part of the investigation, where water keeps secrets that span entire generations, then you absolutely need to hear this complete story. Hit that subscribe button right now at this moment, because what I am about to share with you will fundamentally change how you think about every lake, every reservoir, every single body of water that holds mysteries concealed in its depths. By the end of this video presentation, you will come to understand why this discovery has reopened a case that everyone previously assumed was a tragic but simple drowning incident, and why investigators now believe with growing certainty that David Miller's death may have been anything but accidental in nature. The question is not just simply how he died. The real question is what truly happened on that particular June morning in 1953, and why did it take 71 complete years for the lake to finally give up its closely guarded secret? David Miller was 38 years old in the spring season of 1953, a man whose entire life had been fundamentally shaped by the mountains and waters of western North Carolina. Standing just under 6 feet tall in height, with a solid working man's build that came directly from years of intensive physical labor, David possessed the kind of commanding presence that made people around him feel inherently safe. His face was weathered in the particular way that outdoor work weathers a man over time, with permanent tan lines from his fishing hat and crow's feet wrinkles around his hazel eyes from years of squinting into the bright sun reflecting off water surfaces. His hands were what everyone who knew him remembered most vividly and clearly. They were large and heavily calloused, scarred from countless fish hooks and carpentry work over the years, but surprisingly gentle in their touch. Those remarkable hands could tie a fishing knot in complete and total darkness, could gut and clean a bass fish in under 2 minutes flat, could build furniture so exceptionally fine that people across 3 different counties sought him out specifically for custom work projects. David wore his dark brown hair short and practical in style, and he had developed a distinctive habit of running those scarred hands through it whenever he was thinking deeply about something important. Born in 1915 in a small house that still stood standing on the outskirts of Asheville, David had grown up during the Depression era, learning early in life that survival meant resourcefulness and dedicated hard work. He had started fishing Lake James when it was first created and filled in 1923, when he was just 8 years old, and over the course of 3 decades he had come to know intimately every inlet, every deep spot, every particular place where the big bass liked to hide themselves. Fishing was not just recreation or entertainment for David. It was how he fed his growing family, how he made extra money selling his catch to local restaurants in the area, how he found genuine peace in a world that had been hard on him more often than not throughout his life. His typical daily routine started before the sun rose. David would wake at 4:30 in the morning in the small but tidy house he had built himself on Mountain View Road, approximately 3 miles measured from the lake. He would move quietly and carefully through the dark rooms, not wanting to disturb or wake his wife Linda or their 3 children. The coffee pot would already be prepared and ready from the night before, just needing to be lit and heated. He would drink 1 cup standing positioned at the kitchen window, looking out toward where he knew the lake waited patiently in the darkness, already planning his fishing strategy for the upcoming day. Linda Miller was a slender woman with auburn hair and a quick wit who had fallen deeply in love with David at a church social event in 1937. They had married that same year, and she had spent 16 complete years watching him leave for the lake before dawn, and return smelling distinctly of fish and lake water, his weathered face peaceful in a way it never quite was when on land. She worried constantly about him out there alone, but she understood completely that the lake was where David's soul truly lived. "He's more fish than man sometimes," she would joke light-heartedly with neighbors. But there was genuine truth beneath the humor. Their 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl, ranged in age from 14 years down to 9 years in 1953. Thomas, the eldest child, was already showing clear signs of his father's deep love for fishing, and would beg enthusiastically to go out on the boat on weekends. Sarah, 12 years old, was quieter by nature and preferred staying home with her books, and young Daniel, just 9 years of age, was the family comedian, always making his father laugh heartily, with elaborate stories and wild imagination. David was devoted to all of them in his quiet, steady way of showing affection. He was not the type of father who said, "I love you," often or frequently, but he showed it consistently in 1,000 small ways. Teaching Thomas to read the water patterns, fixing Sarah's bicycle without being asked, whittling small wooden animals for Daniel's growing collection. The community surrounding Lake James in 1953 was tight-knit in the particular way that rural mountain communities were during that era, everyone knowing everyone else's business, but looking out for each other too. David was genuinely respected there, known widely as honest, reliable, someone who would help a neighbor without expecting anything in return or compensation. He had pulled 3 different people out of the lake over the years when their boats capsized, unexpectedly. He had given away more fish than he had sold commercially, dropping off stringfuls at the homes of elderly neighbors or families going through hard times financially. His boat was a 14-foot wooden craft he had built himself during the winter season of 1951, constructed carefully from pine and oak wood in a small workshop located behind his house. He had painted it green with white trim detailing, and he maintained it obsessively and carefully, checking every plank, every seal, every joint before each fishing season began. The boat had no motor attached, just oars and occasionally a small sail David had rigged for when the wind was favorable and cooperative. He preferred the quiet sound of rowing, the way it allowed him to hear the lake clearly, read its subtle moods, understand precisely where the fish were moving. What made David's sudden disappearance so shocking, so completely impossible to understand at first, was his extensive expertise. This was not a careless man by any measure. This was not someone who took foolish risks or ignored dangerous weather conditions. David Miller knew Lake James better than anyone else alive at that time. He could read approaching storms an hour before they actually hit the area. He knew which areas contained underwater hazards. He had survived successfully on that lake for 30 full years without any incident, through all kinds of varying conditions, all seasons of the year, all weather patterns. The evening of June 6, 1953, David had spent an unusual and notable amount of time preparing his fishing gear. Linda remembered this detail clearly later, how exceptionally meticulous he had been, checking his tackle box twice over, sharpening his filleting knife carefully, coiling his lines with extra care and attention. When she had asked if everything was all right with him, he had smiled warmly and said he just wanted tomorrow to be absolutely perfect. He had a strong feeling, he told her directly, that tomorrow was going to be a particularly good day on the lake. He kissed her good night at 9 o'clock in the evening, earlier than usual, because he planned to be on the water by first light of dawn. He went individually to each child's room, kissed them gently while they slept peacefully, and Linda remembered hearing him pause at each doorway for a long, extended moment, as if carefully memorizing something important. At the time of occurrence, it seemed like nothing unusual. Later, it would haunt her relentlessly for the rest of her entire life. June 7, 1953, arrived with a sky so brilliantly clear it hurt to look at directly. The kind of absolutely perfect early summer morning that the North Carolina mountains are famous for throughout the region. David Miller woke at 4:30 in the morning exactly as planned, dressed himself in his usual fishing clothes, worn canvas pants and a faded blue work shirt, his lucky fishing hat, with the torn brim that Linda had offered to replace a dozen times over the years. He drank his coffee quickly, packed his lunch that Linda had prepared the night before, sandwiches and apples, and at 5:15 in the morning, he loaded his fishing gear into his old Ford pickup truck. The drive to Lake James took 18 minutes on the winding mountain roads. David knew every curve by heart, from memory. He arrived at Morrison's Landing, a small public access point located on the eastern shore at exactly 5:33 in the morning. He knew this timing precisely because Chester Morrison, who owned and operated the small bait shop and boat launch facility there, noted it carefully in the ledger he kept of everyone who used his facilities. Chester was just opening up for business, and he and David exchanged their usual morning greeting, a few brief words about weather conditions and where the fish might be biting that day. David seemed completely normal, Chester would tell investigators later during questioning. Same as always on any other day. Maybe a little quieter than usual, perhaps, but David was a naturally quiet man anyway. He loaded his gear carefully into the boat, checked the oars thoroughly, and pushed off at approximately 5:45. I watched him row out steadily toward the northern section of the lake, toward the Paddy's Creek area. That's where he particularly liked to go for base during this time of year. The sun was just starting to come up over the horizon, and the lake surface was like smooth glass. Perfect conditions for fishing. I went back into the shop to work, and that was the last time I ever saw him alive. The weather conditions that day remained ideal throughout. No storms rolled in unexpectedly, no sudden winds developed, no unexpected changes occurred. The temperature climbed gradually into the low 80s by afternoon, comfortable and clear conditions. Other fishermen were out on the lake throughout the entire day, though Lake James was large enough in size and David's preferred spots remote enough that no one reported seeing him anywhere after he departed from Morrison's Landing. Linda expected David home by 6 o'clock in the evening at the latest possible time. That was their mutual understanding. Even on his best fishing days with excellent catches, he was always home for dinner, always there to help get the younger children to bed. When 6:30 came and went with no sign of his truck in the driveway, she felt the first flutter of worry begin. By 7 o'clock, she was standing on the front porch, watching the road intently. By 7:30, she had called Chester Morrison directly. "David hasn't come home yet," she told him, trying hard to keep her voice steady and calm. "Did you see him come back to the landing today?" Chester's response made her blood run cold with fear. "No, ma'am, I'm afraid not. I closed up at 6 o'clock, and his boat wasn't back yet at that time. I figured he was having such good luck fishing, he lost track of time. You want me to go check the area?" By 8 o'clock in the evening, as the summer sun finally began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that David would have loved and appreciated, a search was beginning to form. Chester Morrison and 3 other local fishermen who had been at the landing that evening took their boats out onto the darkening lake, calling David's name loudly, shining lanterns across the water surface, looking desperately for any sign of the green and white boat. They found nothing at all. The lake, so peaceful and clear all day long, had seemingly swallowed David Miller without leaving a trace. The sheriff's department was officially notified at 9:15 in the evening. Sheriff Raymond Blake, a heavy-set man who had known David since they were young boys, immediately recognized the extreme severity of the situation. David Miller did not just disappear without reason. Something was very seriously wrong. By 10 o'clock at night, despite the darkness, a dozen boats were out on the lake searching. By dawn the next morning, June 8th, the search operation had grown to include over 50 volunteers from the community. The search for David Miller became one of the most intensive operations Lake James had ever witnessed or seen. Men from towns across Burke and McDowell counties showed up to help with the effort. Forestry Service rangers brought specialized equipment for the search. The few recreational divers in the area, using the limited diving equipment available in 1953, simple hard-hat rigs and surface-supplied air systems, attempted to search the deeper sections of the lake where David was known to fish regularly. But Lake James, for all its natural beauty, was and is a challenging body of water to search. Created by damming the Catawba River and Paddy Creek, it covered approximately 6,500 acres, with depths reaching over 100 feet in some areas. In 1953, without modern sonar technology, without GPS navigation systems, without the sophisticated search technology that would come decades later, searching that much water was like looking for a specific grain of sand on a beach. The diving attempts were particularly frustrating for everyone involved. The visibility in Lake James, even in good conditions, was poor below 30 feet depth. The divers could barely see their hands in front of their faces. They worked by feel alone, swimming grid patterns methodically, but the vastness of the lake made comprehensive coverage impossible, and the depth in many of David's favorite fishing spots exceeded what the diving equipment of the era could safely handle. Theories emerged immediately, as they always do when someone vanishes mysteriously. The most obvious, and the one most people initially accepted, was tragic but simple accident. David had somehow fallen overboard, Maybe he had stood up to cast his line and lost his balance. Maybe he had leaned too far, reaching for something. A man overboard in deep water, possibly struck his head on the boat, possibly tangled in fishing line, could drown before he had time to call for help. The boat, no longer weighted by his presence, could have drifted away and eventually sank in a different location. But this theory had significant problems. David was an expert swimmer, something he had learned as a boy and maintained throughout his entire life. He was careful on boats, almost obsessively so. And if he had gone overboard in the morning hours, why had not any of the other fishermen on the lake that day seen his boat drifting empty? A darker theory suggested potential foul play. Perhaps David had witnessed something he should not have. Lake James, like many remote bodies of water in the 1950s, was occasionally used for illegal activities. Moonshine stills operated in the surrounding mountains. There were whispers of gambling operations and other crimes. Had David seen something that got him killed? But this theory, too, had significant issues. David's wallet, containing $43, was found in his truck at Morrison's Landing. If this was robbery or murder, why leave the money behind? Some people wondered about suicide, though those who knew David well rejected this almost violently. He had a family he adored deeply. His carpentry business was successful and thriving. He showed no signs of depression or distress. And David Miller was not the type to cause his family the pain of uncertainty. If he had wanted to die, he would have left a note, made arrangements, not disappeared in a way that would torture Linda and his children with unanswered questions. Medical emergency was another possibility to consider. A heart attack, a stroke, something sudden and catastrophic that incapacitated him on the boat. But again, what happened to the boat? Why had it not been found? Drifting? The search continued for 3 full weeks, gradually diminishing as hope faded. The divers made repeated attempts in the areas where David was most likely to have been fishing. Boats dragged the lake bottom with hooks and chains, a grim but common technique for recovering drowning victims. Nothing was found at all. Not David's body, not his boat, not a single piece of his fishing equipment. On June 28, 1953, 3 weeks after David's disappearance, Sheriff Iuha Blake stood on the porch of the Miller house and had the hardest conversation of his career. "Linda," he said gently and carefully, "we have to suspend the active search operation. We are not giving up entirely. We will keep looking whenever we are out there, but we cannot maintain this level of operation indefinitely." Linda Miller nodded, her face blank with shock and overwhelming grief. She had known this moment was coming eventually. The official determination, filed on July 2, 1953, was presumed accidental drowning. The case remained open, technically speaking, but in practical terms, David Miller had become another tragic statistic, another life claimed by the water. For Linda Miller and her children, the next 71 years were shaped entirely by that profound absence. Linda never remarried, never stopped wearing her wedding ring, never stopped hoping that somehow, impossibly, there would be an explanation. She lived in that house on Mountain View Road until her death in 1998, at the age of 86, never knowing what happened to her husband. Thomas Miller, the eldest son who had been 14 years old when his father disappeared, spent his teenage years angry at the lake, angry at the world, angry at his father for leaving, even though he knew it was not David's choice. He never went fishing again, could not bear the sight of Lake James. He moved to Charlotte after high school, became an insurance adjuster, lived a quiet life, and died in 2019 at the age of 80. Sarah Miller, 12 years old when she lost her father, became obsessed with finding answers. As an adult, she would spend weekends at the lake, talking to old-timers, researching records, hoping someone would remember something useful. She never married, poured her life into teaching elementary school in Asheville, and in her retirement years became something of a local expert on Lake James's history and mysteries. In 2000, 24, at the age of 83, she was still alive, still searching, still hoping. Daniel Miller, just 9 years old when his father vanished, remembered his father in fragments: the smell of fish and lake water, the sound of his laugh, the feel of his calloused hands. He became a minister, perhaps seeking answers to existential questions that his father's disappearance had forced him to confront too young. He was 80 years old in 2024, living in a retirement community in Morganton, still conducting occasional sermons, still thinking about that June morning. The decades rolled on, and Lake James changed considerably. What had been a relatively quiet fishing spot in the 1950s became a popular recreation area. Vacation homes were built along the shores, the lake filled with jet skis and pleasure boats. Young people who swam and played in the water had no idea that somewhere beneath them, a man's final moments were frozen in time, preserved in the dark, cold depths. The story of David Miller became local legend, the kind of tale that gets told around campfires and at family gatherings. Each generation added its own embellishments, its own theories. Some claimed David's ghost could be seen on foggy mornings, rowing his boat across the water, eternally searching for the shore. Others said the lake was cursed, that it demanded sacrifices. Most just shook their heads sadly and moved on with their lives. Sarah Miller never stopped, advocating for new searches. In the 1980s, when improved diving equipment became available, she organized a small expedition, funding it with her own money. They found old tires, sunken logs, even a car that had gone off the road decades earlier, but no sign of her father or his boat. In the 1990s, she lobbied for sonar scanning of the lake. A few searches were conducted, focusing on the areas where David was most likely to have been, but Lake James was vast, and the scans were limited. Again, nothing was found. By the 2020s, most people assumed David Miller's remains would never be recovered. The lake had kept its secret too long. Whatever had happened in 1953 was lost to history. Another mystery that would die with the generation that remembered it. Sarah Miller, in her early 80s and in declining health, had begun to accept that she would join her mother in dying without answers. And then, in the spring of 2024, Duke Energy announced something unusual. The dams at Lake James, built in the 1920s and showing their age, required extensive maintenance and structural assessment. For the first time since the lake was created over a century ago, they would need to drain it to historically low levels. The work would take most of the summer. Lakefront property owners were notified. Boat launches would be closed. The beloved recreation area would be essentially unusable for months. The ISA draining began in early May 2024. Slowly, methodically, the water level dropped. Shorelines that had not been visible in living memory began to appear. Old foundations of buildings flooded when the dam was built emerged from the water. Trees that had been submerged for a century stood like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. By mid-June, the lake was at its lowest level since 1923. Engineers and maintenance crews worked on the exposed dam structure. Historians and archaeologists explored the revealed landscape, documenting what had been hidden for so long. And on June 17th, 2024, almost exactly 71 years after David Miller disappeared, a Duke Energy supervisor named Marcus Webb was walking the exposed lake bottom in the northern section, the area that had once been called the Paddy's Creek section, and he saw something that made him stop cold. Embedded in the thick mud, about 70 feet from what the current waterline would normally be, was a boat. A small wooden boat, dark with age, partially collapsed, but still recognizably intact. Marcus had grown up in the area. He knew the stories. He knew the legend of David Miller. He pulled out his phone and called his supervisor. Within an hour, the site was cordoned off, and law enforcement had been notified. The Burke County Sheriff's Department arrived with a forensic team. They photographed everything from every angle before anyone touched anything. The boat sat in mud that had preserved it remarkably well. The wood was swollen and dark, but the structure was largely intact. The green and white paint, faded and mostly gone, was still visible in places. And inside the boat, tangled in collapsed wooden seats and 71 years of accumulated sediment, were bones. Human bones. The immediate area was treated as a potential crime scene, though the phrase felt almost absurd, applied to something that had happened when Eisenhower was president. The remains were carefully excavated over 2 days. The county medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Chen, supervised personally. What emerged told a story that was both heartbreaking and deeply strange. The skeletal remains were those of an adult male, approximately 5'10" to 6 feet tall, consistent with David Miller's description. Dental records, miraculously preserved in the files of a long-closed Asheville dentist's office and found by a persistent archivist, would later provide positive identification. It was him. After 71 years, David Miller had been found. But it was what else they found in the boat that transformed this from a tragic drowning into something much more disturbing. Wrapped around the skeletal legs, preserved by the mud and lack of oxygen, were multiple lengths of rope. Heavy rope, the kind used for mooring boats or securing cargo. The rope had been tied deliberately, knotted, wrapped around the leg bones multiple times. David Miller's legs had been bound. The discovery sent shock waves through the community and beyond. Sarah Miller received the call on June 18th. She wept for an hour, then got in her car and drove to Lake James. She stood at the edge of the drained lake, looking at the cordoned-off area where her father had been found, and felt a mixture of relief, grief, and horror so profound she thought it might break her. Her brother Daniel arrived the next day, making the drive from Morganton. They stood together, siblings in their 80s, finally having an answer, but discovering that answer brought more questions than it resolved. The investigation that followed was unlike anything Burke County had seen. This was a crime scene from 1953 being investigated with 2024 technology. The rope was analyzed using modern forensic techniques. It was hemp rope, common in the 1950s, showing signs of weathering consistent with being underwater for decades. The knots were examined by experts who determined they were maritime knots, professionally tied, the kind someone with boat experience would know. The boat itself provided more evidence. It was definitely David's, confirmed by construction details and the remnants of a nameplate that read Miller carved into the stern. But the boat showed damage that forensic analysis suggested had not come from sinking naturally. Several planks had been deliberately pried loose from the inside, as if someone had wanted to ensure the boat would sink and sink fast. The position of the remains suggested David had been sitting in the boat when it went down. The rope around his legs would have prevented him from swimming away. Medical analysis of the bones, limited after so many years but still revealing, found no evidence of head trauma or other injuries that would have explained immediate death. The horrifying implication: David Miller had been conscious, alive, when his boat was sabotaged and began to sink. He had drowned, trapped, and helpless, in the dark, cold water of Lake James. This was not an accident. This was murder. Deliberate, calculated, cold-blooded murder. The case was officially reopened as a homicide investigation on June 20th, 2024. The FBI was consulted given the age of the case and the complexity of the evidence. Modern investigative techniques were applied to a 71-year-old crime, a bizarre intersection of past and present. But investigating a murder, 2024, presented challenges that were almost insurmountable. Every potential suspect, every witness, every person who had been at Lake James that day was either deceased or in their 90s. Chester Morrison, who had been the last person to see David alive, had died in 1989. Sheriff Raymond Blake passed in 1976. The entire context of 1953, the social dynamics, the local tensions, the possible motives, existed now only in fading memories and incomplete records. Investigators began piecing together what they could. They discovered that David had been planning to testify in a local trial scheduled for late June 1953. The trial involved a property dispute between two prominent families in Burke County, and David had witnessed something relevant to the case. Whether this was connected to his murder was impossible to say. Both families in the dispute had died out or moved away decades ago. They found old rumors, whispers that had circulated in 1953 but never made it into official reports. Some people had suspected David might have been involved with bootleggers, not as a participant, but as someone who had seen too much. The mountains around Lake James had been moonshine country, and several illegal stills had operated in the area in the 1950s. Had David witnessed an operation he should not have? Again, impossible to verify. The people involved were long dead. The most intriguing lead came from an unexpected source. A 94-year-old woman named Martha Hughes, living in a nursing home in Morganton, saw news coverage of the discovery and contacted the sheriff's department. Martha had been 23 in 1953, working at Morrison's bait shop. She remembered the day David disappeared because she had seen something odd that morning. There was another man, she told investigators, her memory remarkably clear, despite her age. He came to the landing maybe 30 minutes after David left. He asked Chester if he had seen David Miller go out. Chester said yes, pointed out the direction. The man thanked him and left. I remember thinking it was strange, because he did not have a boat, did not have fishing gear. He just wanted to know where David went. And he had mean eyes. That's what I remember most. Mean eyes. Martha could not remember what the man looked like beyond that. Could not say if she would recognize him. But she was certain about what she had seen. The FBI added this to their timeline. Someone had been looking for David that morning. Someone who had tracked him to the lake. Another elderly witness, a man named Robert Patterson, 89, recalled being out on the lake that morning. He had been 18, fishing with his uncle in a different section. Around mid-morning, maybe 10 or 11 in the morning, he had heard what sounded like shouting coming from the northern section. By the time he and his uncle had rowed over to investigate, there was nothing. Just empty water. He had forgotten about it until all these years later, seeing the news, remembering that morning. The investigation revealed something else disturbing. A search of historical records showed that in the weeks following David's disappearance, 3 men had left Burke County suddenly. One had been a local businessman with rumored criminal connections. One had been a laborer who had worked various jobs around the lake. The third had been a deputy sheriff, though no records indicated he was under investigation. All three were dead now, had been for decades. Whether their departures were connected to David's murder was speculation, but the timing was suspicious. The rope used to bind David's legs was traced. As much as 71-year-old rope could be traced. It was a type commonly used in the area in the 1950s, sold at multiple locations including Morrison's bait shop. In other words, it told them nothing useful. So, where does this leave us? 71 years after David Miller was murdered on Lake James, we have a victim, we have evidence of murder, but we likely will never have a killer. Everyone who might have been responsible is dead. Every potential witness has taken their knowledge to the grave. What we are left with are theories, educated guesses based on fragments of evidence and fading memories. The most plausible scenario is that David witnessed something criminal, probably illegal alcohol operations given the time and place. Someone decided he was a threat and needed to be eliminated. They followed him to the lake that morning, possibly with an accomplice, given that it would have taken at least 2 people to overpower David and sabotage his boat while keeping him controlled. They boarded his boat, perhaps under some pretext. They tied his legs, ensuring he could not escape. They pried loose planks in the boat's hull, creating holes that would flood the boat slowly. And then they left him to drown, rowing away in their own boat, leaving David Miller to sink into the darkness of Lake James. It was a perfect crime in many ways. The lake kept the evidence hidden for 7 decades. The perpetrators died without consequences, their secrets safe. David's family suffered for generations without answers. Justice was delayed for so long that it became impossible. But there are elements that still do not quite fit. Why take such an elaborate approach? If the goal was simply to kill David, there were easier methods. The deliberate sinking of the boat suggests someone wanted it to look like an accident, but they had to know the boat would eventually be found if the lake was ever drained. Unless they never imagined that would happen. In 1953, Lake James seemed permanent, eternal. Who could have foreseen that 70 years later, maintenance would reveal what the water had hidden? And there is another disturbing possibility that investigators have considered. What if this was not about David at all? What if the boat contained something else, something valuable or incriminating that someone wanted buried? What if David was simply in the wrong place, with the wrong knowledge? The forensic analysis of the boat found no other objects of note, but 71 years of submersion could have destroyed or dispersed whatever might have been there. Sarah Miller, at 83, finally has the answer she spent her life seeking, but it is an answer that brings no peace. Her father was murdered, deliberately and cruelly, but his killer or killers are beyond the reach of justice. Daniel Miller, 80, struggles with anger at a system that failed his father, at a crime that was hidden for so long that accountability became impossible. The remains of David Miller were cremated in July 2024 and laid to rest next to his wife Linda in the Asheville City Cemetery. Sarah and Daniel stood together at the service, the last living connections to a man whose death shaped their entire lives. The small ceremony was attended by dozens of people, some who remembered David from their childhood, most who knew him only as a story, a mystery, a symbol of every unresolved tragedy that time eventually erases. The investigation remains technically open. If new evidence emerges, if some deathbed confession surfaces, if some forgotten document comes to light, the case could theoretically be solved. But realistically, the truth died with the people who knew it. David Miller's murder will almost certainly remain unsolved forever. Lake James has been refilled. The water has returned to its normal levels, covering once again the mud where David's boat rested for 7 decades. People are swimming there again, fishing again, living their lives on and around water that holds who knows how many other secrets. The spot where David was found is marked on no map, memorialized in no official way. It is just water now, looking exactly like every other part of the lake. But those who know the story cannot help but think about it when they see Lake James. Cannot help but wonder what else is down there. What other mysteries rest in the cold darkness? How many other disappearances are not disappearances at all, but murders so well hidden that they became legends? David Miller was 38 when he died on that June morning in 1953. He had been robbed of watching his children grow up, of meeting his grandchildren, of growing old with the wife who loved him enough to wait 71 years for his return. He had been killed for reasons we can only guess at, by people whose names we may never know. And he had been abandoned in the darkness of Lake James, his family left to wonder and grieve for a lifetime. The water keeps its secrets until it does not. And when those secrets finally emerge, they bring not closure, but new questions, new pain, new understanding of how much violence can be hidden beneath a placid surface. David Miller's story is a reminder that every missing person, every unsolved case, every mystery that time seems to erase, represents a real person, a real family, a real injustice that deserves to be remembered and honored. If you have any information about David Miller's disappearance, if you have heard stories from parents or grandparents about strange happenings at Lake James in 1953, if you have any knowledge that might bring additional clarity to this case, the Burke County Sheriff's Department is still accepting information. The FBI maintains files on the case. Even 71 years later, even when justice seems impossible, the truth still matters greatly. Because David Miller mattered. His life mattered. And the person who took that life, whoever they were, should be remembered not as someone who got away with murder, but as a killer whose crime, no matter how long hidden, eventually came to light. The lake gave up its secret. The least we can do is make sure that secret is never forgotten.